All right, I'm going to start with that breathing exercise from yesterday. Just everybody, right? Oh, this is exciting. I am so excited to be here to talk to you about paperwork. So who am I first? Just so if you don't know me, I'm a staff engineer at Spotify. I'm also part of our incident manager on call team. So I spend a lot of time looking at incidents across the company, even though I focus mostly on our B2B systems. I've had about 25 plus years in tech, longer than that if you count when I was playing with my computer in my garage. I've worked in all kinds of jobs. I came up more through the sysadmin, PC tech world, not so much the software engineering, but I've been an ERP or software developer, an architect. I know that's a bad word with some people. I've basically done it all, and if you've had a computer system, I've probably played with it. I was really lucky enough to be trained in deep incident analysis by John Allspaw and Dr. Richard Cook before he passed as part of ACL. So why am I here today? One of the things that's become very important to me as my career has progressed and as I've had many children, probably too many, is psychological safety. I've seen the value of alignment and of growing empathy in teams and people who are working together in really complex systems with a lot of consequences. And it's really important to me, and that's one of the reasons the LFI community has spoken to me. So today I'm going to talk to you about another way that we can build psychological safety. I also want to share our process that we use to look at incidents in a little different way than maybe a deep analysis, or maybe that you've seen. I also just want to inspire and collaborate with you. We came up with this on our own. We've iterated on it, but it's time to release it to the world. And I've noticed actually there's some other people doing similar things. So I'd love to continue to collaborate with you in the Slack after this conversation. But mostly I just want to dig into these mundane stacks of paperwork with you and process artifacts and see if we can pull out some gold from what you've been making. So I also want to just have a word on sharing in public. I don't know if everybody feels this way, but it's not the default for corporations to talk about this dirty laundry type of stuff. And so it takes some effort. It took some effort on my part and on my managers and even their managers to be able to share with you more than just vague details. So I want to encourage you all to also do that work. I think it really adds context. I've seen other people doing it. And just, let's make that the norm. Let's get these things out there. I also forgot to say, I want to thank Courtney Nash for titling this talk, Incident Archaeology, during the Void podcast, and also encouraging everyone to get these public incident reports and processes out there. So what am I here to talk about? The process that we call incident archaeology or incident studies at Spotify is not about depth. Now, I hope all of you have some kind of practice where you do gain depth on your incidents. The type of things that Adaptive Capacity Labs teaches and that many of us have learned as invaluable are very important, but this is not about that. This is more about looking at all the icebergs, not necessarily finding the bottom of all of them, just what's out there, and even more importantly, all the reports of icebergs. By the end of this, though, I hope you have at least a surface level understanding of how to take a look at a collection of incidents and how we've been able to learn things about the incident process and why we declare incidents and things like that. So one of the things that I hear a lot from our senior engineers, people who are really good at building complex systems and running them and operating them, is why do we even file incidents, right? It's just paperwork. Can't I just fix things and move on with my job? Maybe some of you have heard that. And it's a valid question, but I always say it's kind of the wrong question because you're going to have to declare incidents. So the real question is, what's the value of a declared incident? Why are we even asking you to do this? And we all have some answers. I'm sure if you run an incident management program, it's in facilitating communication, making sure that the right people know, and in a transparent way. There's accountability. We know that things didn't go well. We don't sweep it under the rug. Coordination, a complex system often has multiple actors in it. These are the standard answers, right? And maybe if you're lucky, your process is also about learning. It can be these are a lot of values, right? This is a lot of value to extract, but the devil's in the details. How do we get all those values out? Because honestly, this is all the stuff we're asking you all to do, right? file that ticket, right? I love this slide with John in the previous talk. It can be a little bit of an attack. Then once you file the ticket, make sure the status is accurate, estimate the impact, communicate that frequently once you know more about it. Document every action you've taken, coordinate post-incident review meetings, write up a timeline, determine when the start and end times is, facilitate a discussion, right? These are all things we're asking people to do. And they're busy, and they're being measured more on how they're shipping features and change, not how they're handling these things often. And so it was important to us as an incident management focused team to help people answer this. Why am I doing all this? Because now we see violence and error in the system, right? Everyone is feeling oppressed, and what we don't really tell people what the value of all that paperwork that they did. We just say, just do it and shut up and move on, and then we expect them to actually focus on these things. So any of us who focus on, after closing that incident, we just kind of sat down and we wondered, what if we just looked at all the incidents, the stuff that we have, all that stuff they just did, what's in there, right? So I'm going to take you back into the ancient world of 2020. I know it's scary, really scary year. And at the end of 2020, we were like, let's just go do a JIRA JQL export and find all the incident, all the data that we could get. And we actually found that other teams had tried this before. We found some spreadsheets. Google Drive is an endless well of very confusing information. But we did find that there was some desire in the past from teams working part-time on this to get something like MTTR, MTTD. 2020 was kind of, the space framework had just come out. DORA metrics were really important to people. They were important to us. We hadn't quite evolved and understood some of the problems with that, but we thought, well, this would be great. We could do this and publish a paper. So we got all the data and we made some hypotheses. And we said, okay, we've been hearing from engineers that these after-hours incidents are scary. It's important to note that during this time in 2020, Spotify was undergoing a real revolution and adopting something really new and fancy called DevOps. No, it's okay. We called it something else, so it's totally different. It's called Ops and Squads. But essentially, Spotify is a very autonomous culture. It's a bottom-up decision-making culture. Essentially, you're given a mission, not told how to do it. And one of the things we noticed was that we still had top-down on-call. So we tried to ask everybody to be on call, and they were scared. They were like, I'm going to be after hours with this complex system. It's going to be really hard. And so they had a hypothesis. It wasn't even ours, which is that those after-hours incidents will be long and complex. And so we thought, how can we determine that? And the reality is, we actually had a system in place. Our JIRA has a start and an end time. And in theory, that's used to determine MTTR. But first problem that we noticed as we were going through the incidents was that there was not agreement on what a start time is. I'm sure people have seen that. When did the incident start? The example is flapping test wakes an engineer up. By the time they're awake and at their computer, it's recovered. They go back to sleep and snooze the alert, and an hour later, they're woken up again because it's been flapping the whole time. They actually look this time. They see, oh, that's a 15-minute fix. MTTR, 15 minutes, right? So right away, we started to see problems with this data, and we were starting to questioning our own methodologies of even using those start times. And it's a good hypothesis, right? It's falsifiable, but it's built on that shaky ground. And even shakier, we found, was trying to measure complexity, right? That's a whole other topic. But we did get some data, and what we found was mostly that there's almost no incidents after hours. It's not even a big thing. In fact, this graph that you see there with the blue lines, right, that's start time of the incident in New York hours. Most of our teams are centered in New York. And just just showing that data to these new on-call engineers was enough to help them feel confident that it's actually pretty unlikely you'll even be paged at night. One of the other things we found is on the right is the standard all over the place, crazy MTTR. And it doesn't matter, this one's by severity. It doesn't matter how we twist it, right? We've all learned this now. We were just learning this then. it's not useful data. But being able to say that, this is not useful. This was a huge revolution for folks in Spotify. No one had looked at the incidents on this level. Even though we were all entering all this time and doing all this work to do this paperwork, no one had actually used it to say anything. And measuring complexity, which in hindsight, we realized we probably should have made that 2 hypotheses, like complex and MTTR. Those are 2 different things. We sat down and we thought, how are we going to measure this? And this was the rubric that we wrote. And it's pretty reasonable. I challenge you to, without the knowledge in all of your head on how wrong this is, to say, we're not going to learn anything from this. And the reality is, we kind of did learn something from it. Mostly this is bad. It doesn't work. We spent so much time looking at each incident and going I don't know, was that a senior engineer fixing it? Were they required? These rubrics really matter, and one of the important things we learned is that complexity is complex. We also had another hypothesis, which was that at least 50% of the S4A, that's Spotify for Artists, incidents will have a high avoidability. I'm embarrassed by this one. It took a lot of courage for me to share this one with you. This is basically, we like counterfactuals, and we're going to measure them. All right? We were learning. We learned a lot by trying to measure a counterfactual. What we mostly learned is that it's really easy to just score it 3, which is neither high nor low. And even when we did score them higher, we didn't really learn anything. So this ultimately taught us we need to pay more attention to these hypotheses. So as we were going through this study, we thought, our conclusions aren't that great on these hypotheses, but we did get a really interesting result that we didn't expect. We found out that there were 45% of our incidents had no postmortem. Now, a lot of these were S3s, but some of these were Sev 1s. These were serious incidents. They cost the company time and money, and people had just skipped it. And that's a problem. We had been working under the assumption that they always happen, that people understand they are required. And in fact, we learned they're not happening. This was another evidence that we were asking people to do too much. And we just, we hadn't really ever told people how important it was. When we actually showed people this graph, a lot of them got angry because they were like, I did postmortems 100% of the time. Well, it turns out they had the meeting. They actually almost always had the meeting. But did they actually write anything down? That was a big problem. Another thing that happened, about this time, we hadn't really engaged with our data science group. And this graph, among others, was in our published paper internally. It's not good. It was really cringy. They were so polite in telling us how terribly, terribly stupid this graph was. And we realized that we should have probably engaged them way earlier. And once we did, in the next year, we actually found that they had great suggestions. They had also a lot more knowledge of what data was available at the company so that we could sort of check in on other sources, not just JIRA tickets. So fast forward to the next year. It's the end of 2021, and we come up with supposedly better hypotheses. So we said, okay, we have spent the last year being incessant about postmortems, write them down, do them. I mean, we were super annoying about it. And we also were really helpful. We offered to facilitate, and we essentially put ourselves out there as the postmortem crew. And so we're like, this is great. We've seen this happening. Postmortems are the norm. What's a norm, by the way, anybody? It's all right. We were learning. But it was one of the things that we really liked about this one was that it's a binary. It either happened or it didn't. We can find evidence or we can't find evidence. And that allowed us to burn less of the time box on this thing and spend more time analyzing other things. Well, we were disappointed. We actually eliminated the unclear status because if it's unclear, it doesn't exist. Because this is archaeology, we don't think maybe there's something there. But not a big change. From 55% compliance to 62, it was pretty disappointing. We're like, what have we been doing last year? And we kind of had to have a moment of why are we bothering people if they're just going to ignore us, right? So one of the things we did was we started doing user research based on this. And when we talked to people, we said, oh yeah, we know, we're supposed to do them. But have you seen the templates? Have you seen the process of the postmortem? It's ambiguous, it's heavyweight. We learned so much by just realizing that it doesn't matter that you just keep reminding people. If you don't tell them how to do it and you don't give them options, they'll just skip the paperwork if they can. Because we had more time, now that we weren't looking at counterfactuals and trying to measure complexity and reason so heavily about the content of the incident, we were able to add some cool other interesting things that we didn't have hypotheses about, but we just thought this would be a good thing to go ahead and like kind of do a census on. So we came up with this rubric, and I know you're squinting at that, but essentially what you have is 2 columns. We said if it happens during work hours and you see behaviors like this, pick this score. If it happened during non-work hours or basically started during non-work hours, choose these. This was really a joy to measure. Looking at each incident, we could jump right in. You could tell pretty easily whether or not it started after hours or not. We were able to tell like multiple contributors involved before there was a mitigation found. This one was easy to measure, really quick to get to conclusions. And when we matched it up with some of the other data, we got like a massive signal on what's going on with the postmortem rate. Even better than the user research we had right here. If you don't bother people with your incident, they're not going to bother you to do a postmortem. And that's the cycle that we found. And when we went back and did more user research with our folks again, they were like, oh yeah, why, like I've got 1,000 things to do that aren't incident management. And I'm not going to get promoted for like wasting time. So we found that the more people that got involved and the more disruptive that an event was, the more likely it was they'd do a postmortem. This allowed us to focus on advocating for doing postmortems in less disruptive events because you can learn just as much from those. So that's just a couple of the findings we had. I want to share the process with you. It's actually pretty simple, and it should just look like science, right? But essentially, this is our process. The first thing is go and find some artifacts. I guarantee you have artifacts of incidents. Hopefully you have a ticketing system. Maybe you go dig around in PagerDuty. You might have documents that are in a folder somewhere. However you're asking people to document that an incident happened, you've got artifacts, and you've got them attached. So go find some, take a look at them, and try to reason about, given all that data, how much time can you commit to studying them? Once you do that, you can sort of divide and say, okay, we're willing to commit 30 hours to looking at these. We've got 150 incidents, do the math. That's how much time you can spend per incident. Once you've thought about that, how much time we're going to look at them, how much data we have, then you start to build these hypotheses. We actually kind of did this in the wrong order the first time. We had hypotheses first. They were very hard to prove. Now that we know kind of how much we can invest, we can think about how deep questions we can ask about the collection. Then you want to make a methodology that'll fit in that time box. So are we going to go look at calendars of people? Are we going to dig around in Slack? Are we going to leverage a tool like Jelly, for instance, which we used a lot to look at some of the deeper incidents? Whatever it is, you want to make a methodology that fits in your time box. This is where you call data science. Anybody who has a good statistical background will do, but hopefully your company has somebody who can evaluate your methodology, evaluate your hypotheses, and give you some feedback on whether or not these are falsifiable, whether or not you can actually even do that kind of correlation with this population. Just spend an hour with a data scientist. They'll be really happy to see you. It's something totally new. It's not like the same old user engagement scores. Really fun cycle to have. Once you've run it by a data scientist, get to work. Our team of 3 people broke it up into a Google Sheet, and we just sort of managed who's looking at this one, what's the status, and ran through them, created columns for each of the quantitative and qualitatives, filled them in. The first incident study, I think we spent 30 hours looking at all the incidents that we had, which was about 150. Second one, I think we did 50 hours. We looked at like 175 incidents. This is actually pretty fun. At the beginning, you want to pair up, and I'll talk a little more, give some tips on how to make this go successfully. But as we went through, it became a pretty automated, almost, just fairly easy, sit back, get some popcorn and run through the incidents. It's also kind of fun. Like, looking back in the history, you're sitting there in December, you're looking at something that happened last February, and you're like, oh, I remember that one. Like that was crazy, and you might learn something. Once you've got them all done, do some data checks. Pretty much every step after 5, you want to check in with data science, have them pair with you, things like that. You want to do some data analysis. We use Jupyter to just kind of pull in that data. It's really useful. We're a BigQuery shop. We just pull in other data sources to join up with them. Spend some time analyzing, doing your correlations. You can set some of this up ahead of time, but it's it's a pretty fun process for me. This is where your curiosity gets to kind of explode into these incidents. This is where I've found so many weird things. And I shared with you some macro stuff, but also really stuff about teams. There's some teams that are special you find out here. This is my favorite part of the whole process. And then write it up, learn, share, repeat the cycle. And keep your laptop unlocked, apparently. So while doing this, we held some guiding principles in place. I think these are super important. One is that we're not fixing things today. We see all kinds of problems in the JIRA tickets. They're like, oh, I know that's a Sev 1, but it didn't have a severity. Just don't do it. This is the time to look, not to touch. We only analyze what we can find. You may know something about this, and this is sort of the curse of knowledge. But if it's not there, you make a note, we think this was probably true, but nobody wrote it down, and we couldn't follow the breadcrumbs back to it, so we only look at what we can find. The time box must be respected. It's not just because we have a busy life and we want to get through it, but also just for rigor. Make sure that you're not spending extra time because it's an extra interesting one. We did have a little tag that we put on these ones called highlight, and we came back and dove into them and did more deep analysis when we were like, wow, I didn't even know that happened. This is crazy, everyone needs to know about that. That's later. And then transparency, critical to building trust. The moment we published, we saw the number of little faces on the worksheet just explode. Everybody was like, oh, I don't know, is it really did they really look at my incident right? It's really important. We had notes in there. We put everything where everyone could see it. This is why we think what it is if it wasn't 100% clear. And that really, we got feedback right away that was very helpful to people. And we also got feedback that we got a bunch of stuff wrong, which was helpful for us to learn as well. I cannot stress this enough. Correlations with this data are really problematic. Our data scientist is frowning at us quite a bit in that first cycle. We've gotten better at avoiding this pitfall. It's a small sample size. The population is unknown, maybe infinite, as we talked about in the keynote, right? So only if it's very clear and your data scientist agrees, which we have had some findings, and you can find some of those on our engineering blog and in the Void podcast. I talked about those as well around synthetic testing and time to detect. But just same p-value is really hard to come by. They are to come by. And we think of it more as a census, right? You're just tabulating what is true in what places and looking at things in more of a population facts based, not trying to make statistical correlations, unless you can. And it's really important to have rigorous investigations. One of our engineers came up with a novel tactic of just pulling in everyone's calendars and adding that as a column so you could see during the start and end time what was on their calendar. That was great, but we had to go back and automate it and pull it in because if we did it for one incident, we need to do it for all. So any of those, they need to be written down. Again, transparency. Pairing is vital, especially for checking yourself and being able to hold each other accountable. We also did sort of meta reviews. And just as a little bit of extra, these are some things that we learned that we weren't looking for. Severity isn't the only driver of chaos. There were super low severity incidents that pulled in hundreds of people. There were high severity incidents that pulled in only a few. But it does actually drive most of the chaos. The other thing, again, I've already mentioned it, but nobody knows what start and end time of incidents means. MTTR is essentially should be dead and should be killed. You can get my support on that. Also, if you have a default start time, people will just set it, so 75% of our users never even bothered to adjust them. Uptime success can hide massive problems with productivity. We saw teams with the best uptime often had the worst incident practices and a lot of chaos and were burnt out, and vice versa. Another thing we found, 80% of our incidents during business hours. After hours is important, but during business hours, way bigger driver. And only 30% of those incidents actually were local change failures, meaning it was just failure to adapt to the changing environment. So that's all I have. I'm sorry I didn't give any time for questions, but I really appreciate all your time, and I hope we can analyze collections of incidents together. Thank you.